All right, today we're diving into something that might just change the way you think about medieval Indian history. It's all based on a study called Sūdrāyana, and believe me, it's not afraid to challenge some of the biggest stories we've all been taught. So let's start with a big one. What if the history you learned in school was wrong? And I don't mean just a few dates mixed up. I mean, what if it was missing a massive piece of the puzzle? That's the question we're tackling today. You know, history isn't some dusty old book with all the answers. It's actually a live, ongoing argument. And the argument we're jumping into today is all about medieval India, where brand new evidence is going head-to-head with some really old established ideas. So, what's the old idea? Well, for ages, the textbook version, and this was heavily shaped by historians from the colonial era, painted medieval India as this super rigid society. You know, a strict pyramid, the caste system where everyone was locked in their place. This is probably the story you're familiar with. But then this study, Sūdrāyana, comes along and throws a wrench in the works. It says, hold on a second, because new research, especially from a field called epigraphy, that's the study of old inscriptions, stuff carved into stone and metal plates, is uncovering a totally different reality, a much more complicated one. And get this, the study isn't just about digging up new facts. It's taking a hard look at how some historians today are explaining those facts. So it's not just about what happened back then, it's about the narrative we build around it. Okay, and this is where it gets spicy. The study makes a pretty bold claim. It basically accuses some modern academics of sophistry. What does that mean? Well, it's saying they're force-fitting the data, cherry-picking bits and pieces of evidence to back up their favorite theories about class conflict and oppression, rather than just following where the evidence leads. So what are these big theories they're talking about? The study calls them tropes. Basically, these common stories that get told over and over until we all just assume they're true. Things like Sudra kings were rebels fighting the system, or that the invading sultanates were the ones who brought economic innovation. The Sūdrāyana study is saying, let's actually check the receipts on these claims. And to prove their point, they don't just talk in generalities. Nope. They zoom right in on a specific case study. The reign of a Sudra king named Prataparudra of the Kakatiya dynasty. He's our guy. Now, the full study is pretty ambitious. It actually looks at 4 major moments in South Indian history, saying this is a pattern that repeats. But for us, today, we're going to laser focus on that very first period, the time of the Kakatiyas, right up to the fall of their capital city, Warangal. This is where the story really gets going. All right, so let's properly introduce the main character of our story. This is Prataparudra, who the study calls the Proud Sudra. He's the last king of this major dynasty, and his reign, his actions, well, that's the key that the study uses to test all those big historical claims. Okay, now we get to the really good part. We're going to put it all on the table. On one side, we've got those common historical tropes, and on the other, we've got the hard evidence the Sūdrāyana study brings to the fight. Let's see how they stack up. First trope on the chopping block? It's a huge one. It's the idea that if a Sudra king came to power, it must have been a revolution, right? A rebellion against the traditional social order, the so-called Brahminical system. But then you look at the evidence, and it tells a completely different story. The trope says these kings rejected the system, but the study points to actual stone inscriptions that show Prataparudra giving land grants to Brahmins. And his entire justice system, it was built on upholding the Dharma Shastras, the traditional legal codes, not tearing them down. That doesn't sound like a revolution, does it? Okay, next up, there's this other idea, that these Sudra kingdoms weren't really complex, established states. The story goes that they were more like simple pastoral societies out on the edge of civilization, a frontier kind of thing. But again, the physical evidence just doesn't line up. The study shows the Kakatiyas weren't some brand new thing. They were part of a long, grand tradition of powerful kingdoms in the region. And here's the kicker. Archaeologists have found proof of advanced, settled farming societies in that same area dating all the way back to the 3rd century BC. That's more than 1,000 years before Prataparudra was even born. So much for a frontier civilization. All right, let's talk about money. There's a popular argument that the invading sultanates were the real economic game changers. The story is that they introduced new ideas like cash and mobile wealth, and they're the ones who plugged the Deccan into bigger international trade networks. But look at what the Sūdrāyana study found. The claim is the sultanates brought mobile wealth. Well, guess what? Archaeologists have found Kakatiya coins in places as far away as China. The claim is they opened up trade.
But inscriptions show the Kakatiyas already had a booming horse trade with Gujarat. They were even collecting commercial taxes in cash. It points to a really sophisticated, connected economy that was doing just fine long before the Sultanates showed up.
So, we've knocked down a few of these common tropes using hard evidence. What does it all add up to? What's the bigger picture? What's the new story that the Sūdrāyana study is trying to tell us? Well, the answer is right there in the name, Sūdrāyana. The study defines it as the story of how these powerful Sudra communities weren't rebels trying to tear things down. Instead, they were central players in preserving, promoting, and even defending the traditional culture, or dharma. So, here it is, the main point, the big thesis. The study basically flips the entire script. It's arguing that powerful Sudra communities, like the one led by Pratapa-Rudra, weren't an oppressed class just waiting for revolution. They were actually the defenders of the very civilization that other historians say they were against. And that's a huge deal. It means they weren't just victims of history. They were actively shaping it, building it, and protecting it. So what do we do with this? We've just walked through how one study uses things like inscriptions and archaeology to challenge a major historical narrative. It leaves you with a really big question, doesn't it? If history is an ongoing argument, and new evidence is always coming to light, how do we decide who's right? It kind of shows you that history isn't something that's finished. The case is never really closed.